Welcome to my presentation on Donald J. Trump, Free to Act, a short introduction to international relations theories. In this presentation, we're going to look at major IR theories in order to see what structural factors pre-exist in the international environment that, at least to some extent, tie Mr. Trump's hands when it comes to achieving the foreign policy objectives that he will ultimately set for his administration once assuming office. In short, I will argue that the international environment constrains actors, even powerful ones like the US president. While this will be unwelcome news for his supporters, those fearful of what a Trump presidency means may be able to take solace in the fact that single actors rarely shape global politics. Irrespective of which facts Mr. Trump chooses to believe, there are structural features in the international system that will shape how he acts. In this presentation, we will take a closer look at some of these features. Let me also mention up front that while we will not be able to enter into great detail for any of the IR theories here covered, the presentation will take roughly 30 minutes overall and will require a good deal of your attention, particularly if you have no previous background in political science. Then again, I suppose crunching information into 140 characters is not necessarily a virtue either. So please turn your brain on, make sure you are not distracted, and bear with me until the end. Let me first give you a little bit of background about this presentation. My name is Marcus, and I have a PhD in political science from the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. The EUI is a truly great place to do research, and in case you're a student of political science, law, economics, or history, you should definitely check out their homepage at www.eui.eu. Since 2014, I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Technische Universität Dresden in Germany, where I also teach courses on international relations, or short IR theories. We also have a great bachelor and master program in international relations, so if you're interested to study IR in Germany, just Google School for International Studies, Dresden. On November 8th, we had an election night special to follow the US presidential elections together with our students. That was the occasion for which I have originally prepared this presentation. Since the outcome was not quite what we expected, some students have asked me to record and share this presentation more widely. In fact, some of my students have become genuinely anxious about Donald Trump's victory. Through this presentation, I hope to be able to alleviate some of these fears, because the bottom line of what I'm going to say is this. While Donald Trump will become a very powerful man, there are limits inherent in the international system as to what he can do. While these limits may be less constraining to the US president than any other person in the world, Donald Trump will not be able to simply do whatever he pleases. In the remainder of the presentation, I will elaborate on the basis of this claim. Before we begin, let me start with a short disclaimer. First, in all honesty, IR theories are not my primary research interest. I'm usually working on the European Union. In fact, I tend to agree with those that think that major IR theories have run their course and all but come to a natural end, leaving junior scholars like me to focus on more limited mid-range theories that, while not tackling the international system and its defining characteristics as a whole, deal with important real-world developments. Nevertheless, these grand theories are still a good starting point to engage with international relations as a scientific discipline, and it is perfectly reasonable to keep applying them to contemporary events. Second, while this presentation and much of my work, including some of my IR courses, are in English, I'm not a native speaker. In case you are, I beg your pardon for the occasional mistake in grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation. Third, while I have taken all reasonable steps to identify the copyright holders of all graphic material included in this presentation, if you are the legal owner and object to me using your work, please contact me at the email address displayed on the slide before seeking legal counsel. I am using all material in good faith and will gladly attribute your work or remove it from this presentation. In academia, it is common practice to begin with a research question to focus attention early on. So for the purpose of this presentation, let our research question be this. Now that Donald Trump is elected President of the United States, can he shape the world as he pleases, or which factors in the international system limit his scope of action? Acknowledged. This research question isn't revolutionary, but for this introductory presentation it should do the job and allow us to focus on various international factors constraining Mr. Trump's freedom of action. To approach this question, we are going to use what is called the agency structure debate. Simplifying slightly, this debate focuses on the relationship between political actors and the environment in which they operate. To keep it simple, at the center of this debate is a political actor, like Donald Trump. But this actor is embedded in an environment that constrains his actions. If you add these two elements up and combine the political actor with the environment, the result is a country's foreign policy as observed in the real world. Foreign policy is always the sum of what political actors want and what they can do, given the enabling structures determined by the international context in which they operate. In this presentation, as in international relations as a discipline more generally, we are going to focus on these environmental factors. While the political actor at the center may change with every election, making this influence on foreign policy idiosyncratic, the structural environment is relatively more stable and lends itself better to systematic research and the accumulation of knowledge over time. Let's take a closer look at what these environmental factors could be and how the international setting influences individual action. Let's again begin with Mr. Trump as the political actor at the center. But to stick closer to the actual terms used in the debate, let's now label him as agent. The term agent has some potential for confusion. It has nothing to do with a Secret Service agent like James Bond. Also, it is not about someone being empowered to act for someone else like a sales agent. Instead, we will use agent in its most fundamental sense. That is simply someone who has the power or authority to act. Let's note that only a single person or a group of persons collectively, like a state, can act. In fact, that is the main factor distinguishing the agent from the environment. The environment cannot act purposefully. This agent is again surrounded by the environment, or more specifically, some pre-existing structure. It is important to note that we will be talking about the international structure. There is a domestic structure constraining the actions of Mr. Trump as well. This domestic structure is the system of checks and balances as inscribed in the US Constitution. But in this presentation, we will be dealing exclusively with international structures that conceive of states as unitary actors and constrain Mr. Trump's freedom of action on a more systemic level. So what are these structural constraints that we will be dealing with here? The first is drawn from realist thinking and goes back to the balance of power. That is the distribution of military capabilities, particularly among the world's major powers. The second constraint are institutional regimes, such as international organizations, as espoused by neoliberal institutionalists. While both realists and institutionalists adhere to a meta-theoretical paradigm described as rational choice, which assumes that actors are calculating individuals weighing the benefits and costs of different alternative courses of action, the third constraint we will be dealing with is constructivism. While realism and institutionalism are closer to economics as a cognate scientific discipline, constructivism brings in sociology and the fundamental insight that political actors are human beings, and human beings are shaped in their actions by identity, norm perceptions, and the power of ideas. As before, foreign policy is the sum of whatever priorities the political actor as agent takes and the constraints imposed by the surrounding structure. Let us take a closer look at each of the three constraints as shown on the slides, beginning with realism. Realism is the oldest IR theory and goes back to around 1950, when Hans Morgenthau wrote Politics Among Nations. Morgenthau is today most closely associated with classical realism, which sees the striving for power and the will to dominate as something innate to humans. This contrasts with neorealism, also called structural realism, as influentially shaped by Kenneth Waltz's theory of international politics. When we speak of realism without any further specification, we usually mean neorealism. Waltz takes the anarchical nature of the international system as his starting point. Anarchical here means that all states are formally equal and there is no higher authority than states in the international system. For example, if a country violates international law and invades another country, the country being attacked cannot simply dial 911 and expect someone to come to its rescue. Importantly, realists also view military power as fungible, which means that a country can harness its military power across the whole spectrum of external relations. For example, also in trade negotiations or in shaping decisions coming out of international organizations. While realism is firmly rooted in a country's military potential, its ambition is to explain international relations far more comprehensively. Because of a lack of trust between states and because states can never be certain that other states raise their military capabilities only for defensive rather than offensive purposes, any country's primary concern is maximum military power to secure its own survival. This gives rise to what is called the security dilemma. Consider the following scenario. One state wants to raise its military capabilities to decrease the likelihood of another state attacking its territory. Another state, however, interprets this increase in military capabilities as increasing its own risk of being attacked and thus raises its capabilities as well. This in turn leads the first state to feel vindicated that it is under threat and raises its military strength even further, which in turn stokes fears in the other state, and so on and so forth. The result is an all-out arms race that, in game theoretical terms, can be styled as a prisoner's dilemma when non-cooperation is the dominant strategy and the collective welfare of the entire system is lower as a result. The most important players in the system are the great powers, which means the states with the greatest military capabilities. The number of great powers in the system also determine the balance of power, which can be unipolar if there is only one great power, bipolar if there are two great powers that can balance each other and fight for hegemony, and multipolar if the power is spread among 3 or more countries. Which power configuration is conducive to peace is somewhat debated. On the one hand, in a unipolar system, power is concentrated, which could trigger all other states to simply submit to the hegemon. On the other hand, the international system is inherently balancing and other states will militarize or try to form alliances to challenge the hegemon's position at the top of the food chain. Anyway, in this presentation we are not interested in the effects on peacefulness. Rather, we are interested in the configuration that would afford Donald Trump the widest discretion to shape the world unilaterally. And here the relationship, as expressed in our first hypothesis, is clear. The more power the United States has vis-à-vis other great powers in the international system, the more freedom of action Mr. Trump enjoys. How then can we measure the distribution of power in the international system? One approach can be found at the Correlates of War project. The Correlates of War project started in 1963 at the University of Michigan and was initiated by political scientist David Singer, who was concerned with collecting data about the history of wars and promote quantitative research on the causes of war, not least in the hope of containing violence in the future. Since then, the project has added a number of other datasets, and all are free for public and academic use given proper citation. To test the realist hypothesis, we are going to use the National Material Capabilities dataset and, more specifically, the Composite Index of National Capability. While power and material capabilities are not identical, they can be assumed to be highly correlated and thus serve as a reasonable approximation. Included in the index are demographic indicators, such as total population, industrial indicators, such as iron and steel production, which is a proxy for industrial strength, and military indicators, such as military expenditure. Overall, the indicators reflect the depth of resources that a nation could bring to bear during fully militarized disputes. In addition, the indicators allow for comparability across a long time period, and in fact, the Composite Index of National Capability is available as far back as 1816. Using this index, let's take a look at how power has evolved in the international system. This graph shows the development of the Composite Index of National Capability for the United States between 1945 and 2007. We can see that at the beginning of this period, the US was very much unrivaled by any other state in the world. However, it is also apparent that its global power has declined steadily and flattened out in the 1970s. Adding Russia, we can see that, save the 1970s and 1980s, its material capabilities were always lower than those of the US. In particular, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the index has dropped markedly. So far, the US clearly leads the race, but when adding China, it becomes clear that the US has itself been overtaken by China in the 1990s. And also when adding Japan, India, and Germany to the mix, it is apparent that China, when using the Composite Index of National Capability, can be considered the most powerful state in the world today. In this small table, we can easily compare the values for 1950 and 2007. For Japan, data for 1950 was unavailable, hence you see here the score for 1952. For Germany, I have decided to take the value for 1941, which was the highest score for Nazi Germany during World War II. As Germany conquered almost all of Europe at the time, this serves as an interesting point of comparison of what a score of 0.2 actually means. After World War II, the US were the most powerful state in the world, and it could, from a realist perspective, also project this power by decisively influencing the emerging global order through events such as Bretton Woods. By 2007, the world has become more multipolar, and China had even overtaken the US. The Composite Index of National Capability is a far from perfect measure for power. Nowhere may this show better than in the case of Russia, which manages to define world politics far beyond what its material capabilities would suggest. Similarly, the US probably deserves a higher score because of its technological advantage in modern warfare and soft power, which means the ability to shape the world through culture rather than material coercion. Nevertheless, the general picture that emerges appears quite accurate, and the world today is more multipolar than it was in the past, and therefore, the US cannot use power to shape the world at this point in history. Importantly, this is mainly due to America's decline of power relative to emerging powers such as China. From this perspective, if Mr. Trump wants to make America great again, he would really have to make China and the rest of the world small again, which is rather unlikely. Anyway, if one accepts the multipolarity of the international system today, Mr. Trump's margin of maneuver is more limited than if the US were the major power it once was. The realist hypothesis thus appears largely confirmed. Let's turn the page and move on to institutionalism, another major IR theory. Institutionalism is younger than realism and dates back to the 1970s and 1980s. Two particularly influential contributions are Power and Interdependence by Robert Cohen and Joseph Nye, and After Hegemony, written by Robert Cohen and published in 1984. As the title suggests, institutionalism positioned itself rather starkly against realism, which was then mainstream thinking in international relations. Institutionalism shares many basic premises with realism, such as the anarchical structure of the international system and the rational nature of state actors. But it has a far more optimistic outlook on interstate cooperation. Because states repeatedly interact with each other, they meet in the shadow of the future, and the international system exhibits far more collaborative features than realists argue. Institutions are difficult to define. Karemenos, Lipson, and Snydel once defined them as explicit public arrangements that prescribe, proscribe, and/or authorize state behavior. This definition is relatively broad and includes everything from international organizations like the World Trade Organization to explicit arrangements like diplomatic immunity that have no formal bureaucracy. Institutions provide a framework for state-to-state interaction and make state behavior predictable, thereby reducing the structural effects of anarchy. For the purposes of this presentation, we will conceive of international institutions more narrowly and only look at international governmental organizations, or short IGOs. Following the IGO dataset, again taken from the Correlates of War project, we will define IGOs as organizations set up by at least 3 states and having permanent headquarters. Since IGOs prescribe, proscribe, and/or authorize state behavior, states, and those leading them, should find themselves constrained in their actions by them. Correspondingly, we can formulate another hypothesis stating the more ITOs the USA is a member of, the more Mr. Trump will be constrained in his actions. Does Mr. Trump feel constrained by ITOs? The picture that emerges from his previous statements seems to translate into a resounding yes. First, he has repeatedly criticized NATO and decried that the US pays a disproportionate share. Even if this entirely misses the other side of the equation, which is the stability that NATO has brought to at least parts of the world, Mr. Trump seems to see ITOs merely in terms of costs associated with them. Second, Donald Trump has threatened to leave NAFTA and the WTO, since it limits his ability to punish American companies moving abroad. Finally, and this quite possibly takes the argument too far, but I have found a headline in which Mr. Trump allegedly even threatens America's status in the United Nations. These speculations have received a boost in light of recent events in the Security Council. It is important to put these plans into perspective, though. It would not be uncommon for a presidential nominee to say one thing during the campaign and then another once elected. Moreover, Donald Trump would not be the first president to assume office with a highly critical opinion towards ITOs, only to later change his mind and realize the potential they offer to pursue policies that he prefers. But these headlines nevertheless show that Trump acknowledges that membership in ITOs constrains his actions at least to some extent. In this graph, we see the number of ITOs that the US has been a member of between 1945 and 2005. The general trend is clearly upwards. The same is true for Russia, China, Japan, and India. For Germany, this trend is even more pronounced. This may well have to do with the fact that Germany is the only European country included, and Europe has a very high number of sovereign states that may accept a strong need to cooperate on a multitude of issues. This table shows the membership in ITOs for selected countries in 2005. South Africa, China, and Japan are members in fewer ITOs than the US. Perhaps surprisingly, Canada, as a much smaller and outward-looking state also situated in North America, is a member in exactly as many ITOs as the US, even if the ITOs are not perfectly identical. Nevertheless, it is fair to say that the US are members in a high number of ITOs. However, what is important to note too is that membership in ITOs is highly selective. For example, the US are not part of the International Criminal Court or the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Therefore, it cherry-picks those ITOs that make sense for it and overwhelmingly conform to its own interests. Moreover, the US sometimes even enjoys historical privileges, like a blocking minority in the International Monetary Fund or a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. Why would any American president want to give that up? Particularly when considering that while ITOs limit a country's options, its influence is far from overriding. Consequently, the US can actually remain a member in ITOs and apply their rules somewhat selectively, enforcing them when it is in their interest and disregarding them when they are not. One should not take either side of this argument to the extreme. ITOs are neither restricting a country's scope of action entirely, nor are they only strawmen doing the most powerful member's bidding, as realists sometimes posit. Still, it would be rather striking if the US really left any of the major ITOs. Therefore, also the institutionalist hypothesis is rather confirmed, making ITOs a rival source of authority that, at least to some extent, tie Mr. Trump's hands. Finally, let's talk a little bit about constructivism. I will not be as extensive here as I was with realism and institutionalism. This is not because I think that constructivism is less important or easier to explain. Quite the contrary. This merely acknowledges the fact that this presentation has taken quite some time already and needs to come to an end. Constructivism came rather late to international relations and really only picked up during the 1990s. Among its most prominent proponents are Martha Finnemore and Alexander Wendt. While both realism and institutionalism explain world politics by assuming that states and their leaders are at least boundedly rational and weigh the benefits and costs of alternative courses of action to ultimately select the option with the highest net benefit, Constructivists subscribe to a logic of appropriateness, viewing humans as social beings that do what feels right. Foreign policy is thus decisively shaped by culture, identity, and ideas. Countries that share common values are part of the same in-group and may be more cooperative than even institutionalists suggest. On the other hand, states with opposing values are more hostile towards each other than even realists think. Moreover, actors cannot be studied in isolation and do not exist independently of their environment. Agency and structure are both mutually constitutive. In that sense, many constructivists would probably principally object to the agency structure debate per se. Nevertheless, if we accept the basic premise that human behavior is shaped not by a calculating logic of consequentialism, but social norms and role conceptions, and that states basically behave like those that lead them, then Donald Trump may become more presidential once in office and act accordingly. As this picture suggests, Mr. Trump may eventually realize that he follows into the footsteps of great personalities like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Abe Lincoln, which may lead him to rethink some of the positions he espoused during his presidential campaign. In fact, his victory speech on November 9th and his interviews immediately afterwards struck a much more conciliatory tone. Unfortunately, since then, he has reverted to his earlier public persona and lashed out at various occasions, mostly on Twitter. Also, his recent press conference wasn't exactly a display of serenity. Still, the role perception of the American presidency that Mr. Trump holds himself could partly guide his behavior once taking seat in the Oval Office. From this perspective, he is a sort of a prisoner of his own upbringing and socialization, making this a very different sort of constraint than those tackled earlier in this presentation. Let's come to the conclusion. In this presentation, we have taken cues from major IR theories to see how the Trump administration may be constrained in its foreign policy. Realism sent us looking for the balance of power in the international system, suggesting that Mr. Trump will find it difficult to bring about changes flying in the face of other powerful states. Some of his plans, like raising tariffs on Chinese imports across the board, will be difficult to execute given China's potential to retaliate on various levels. More generally, the problem with protectionism is that it only works for one state, who free rides on an otherwise open global market. But protectionism begets protectionism, and in the end, everyone loses, not only the losers of globalization. Institutionalism had us looking for the number of IGOs in which the US takes part, which we found to be high, albeit selective. My guess would be that Mr. Trump will not withdraw from any of the major IGOs, and even less bother about withdrawing from those that are less important. He will realize that they perform useful functions supporting American interests and disregard them where they don't. Constructivism pointed us towards social norms and the role understanding that Mr. Trump brings to the presidency once assuming office. There is a chance that he will ultimately define this role more traditionally than would appear now, at least when expressing himself in more than 140 characters. In spite of all these constraints set by the international system, Donald Trump will still have significant margin of maneuver. While most other state leaders would be tightly constrained by the corset of the international system as it currently stands, the President of the United States of America will have much greater latitude for unilateral action, selective application of international regimes, and more broadly, interpret his role as leader of the free world as he wants. In case I managed to trigger your interest in IR theories a little, here are a few contributions that I consulted for this presentation. If you need more time to check them out, simply freeze the picture now. Moreover, you can have a look at the Theory Talks site with contributions by most of the authors that were also mentioned in this presentation. There are also many interesting interviews available on YouTube, and I particularly enjoyed those recorded for UC Berkeley's Conversations with History series, including interviews with Robert Cohane and Kenneth Waltz. If you want to dig even deeper, I recommend the Handbook on International Relations, edited by Walter Kolsness, Thomas Risse, and Beth Simmons. That's it. That's the end of this presentation, at least. I hope you enjoyed it and I managed to awaken your interest in international relations and its theories. If you have any questions or feedback, feel free to post it here on YouTube or go to my Facebook page or Twitter account. Links to all my social media accounts can be found at www.marcus-gastinger.eu. Thanks for watching and best wishes for all of us.